Thank you so much. Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everybody. Thank you again so much for being here today. Yeah, I do have quite a bit of energy, and I have to confess this is my third coffee of the day. So let's just see how this. The worst thing that could possibly happen is I suddenly need to go to the loo, I suppose. But on the upside, let's just hope that it just gives me the fire I need to get through this topic. So just before I put my slides up, I just wanted to say something about climate change. It is a phenomenally complex area to get our heads around. It is just a really tricky topic. There's so much to it. It's so complicated. It's got so many elements. There's science and impacts and governments and policies and all of these things that are all really quite boring and quite dull. And I was just reflecting on what Mark just said now about telling people why you're passionate about a topic. So I thought I would just start by telling you a little bit of my own personal story and the reason why this topic means so much to me. So as an individual and as a person, I love to work in a way that amplifies impact. I see the power of collaboration. I use terms like together we're greater than the sum of our parts, which is very jargonistic and not what we said we would do in this topic, but I really believe in that, and I have seen the evidence of that. Together we can do so much more. I also have two small children. Well, not that small actually, they're teenagers, but they're relatively small, and I know a lot about sustainability and about the impact that it's going to have on our climate and on their future. And I care deeply about that, even though some of the impacts that I know about and can see coming down the line in terms of climate change are not going to affect me personally. So I just thought that I would start with that. And the other thing that I feel really passionate about is, because it's such a complex area, is making it okay for us to participate in it. It is not our responsibility to deal with this issue alone, and this is where the collaboration is so important. We do need to come at this as a society. It can't be dealt with by one government alone, one prime minister alone, one president alone. It has to be dealt with by all aspects of society, and I think that is both empowering and exciting, because if we haven't got the responsibility alone, if we're going to do it together, then it's the single biggest thing that's going to unite us as a race, as a society, and the potential for innovation, for opportunity could be phenomenal, as well as we have a great opportunity to solve some of the great injustices of the world. So let me just share my screen and put myself into the correct presenter mode, which I will do properly this time. So you are in the right place if you've come to listen to me talk about this. And before I go any further as well, we have this theme around humans. So I've told you a little bit about why this particular issue drives me, but also as well as being a strategy consultant and the founder of a company, I play the guitar. As if you saw Mark, we figured out that we have this connection around music, which is phenomenally exciting, and I actually can't wait to delve into a lot further, therefore proving his point about the power of networking. Before I go into the detail of exactly what we're going to talk about, I just wanted to do a little bit of context setting relating to the pandemic. This is the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, and she said this is a screen grab from the ITV News on the 20th of January, before in the UK particularly we were feeling the extreme consequences of the pandemic. She said, the biggest long-term threat to the world's economy is climate change. Unless action is taken now, there is real and present danger. Now, I don't know whether she would have used the superlative biggest if she'd have known what the impact was going to be on the economy from the pandemic. Maybe she might have said one of the biggest, I don't know. And certainly the pandemic has blindsided us all and is continuing to have an extraordinary impact on business, on leaders, on the economics of our world. But this crisis has not gone away while that one's distracting us. So what I'm going to do now for the next sort of 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a little bit of a Q&A, is just remind us very, very quickly of the climate change facts. I want to explore the role of leaders in the context of that. And then I want you to really understand why I believe this is an opportunity. As I said before, I genuinely think this is the most exciting opportunity of your business life, potentially. So, climate crisis. Will, I don't know if you can put up that poll that we did earlier. If I was in the room with you, I'd ask you all to raise your hands and tell me, or shout out and tell me, when you think the climate crisis was first, or climate change was first written about in the press, in a newspaper. So here's your three choices. Was it in 1966, 1984, 1912, or 1936? When do you think that the climate crisis was first written about in the press? So I'm going to submit my answer there, and that will pop up in a minute once you've all voted. So Will, once you've got all the votes in, if you can put that back on the screen, then that would be amazing. Thank you so much. Huge thank you to Will, by the way, from all of us, because he's been in the background making all of this work so smoothly, and we couldn't do it without him. I also just wanted to mention that I decided to put the words climate crisis on the screen here, rather than climate change, because I was talking to someone from the UN earlier on this week who told me that in the UN they have banned using the word climate change. They only refer to it in the UN as a climate crisis or a climate emergency, to try and get this frame of, you know, change feels like there's something that's quite soft that might happen, whereas you know, a crisis or an emergency is something really drastic and urgent that we have to deal with. Oh my gosh, the poll results are up. This is fantastic. So 35%, even we've got two first places of either 1966 or 1936. 6% have said 1984 and 24% have said 1912. Well, I can tell you the answer is 1912. So congratulations to 24%. I suspect that some of those people might be those that have seen some of my presentation before they knew the answer. My fellow panelists. Before I go on any further, and I will change slide, I'm looking at a boring slide now for the last couple of minutes. I just want to read to you that article from the press. It said, it was in a New Zealand newspaper, and it was in the science and notes section of the newspaper in 1912. And it said, the furnaces of the world are now burning about 2 billion tons of coal a year. When this is burned, uniting with oxygen, it adds about 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere yearly. This tends to make the air a more effective blanket for the Earth and to raise its temperature. The effect may be considerable in a few centuries. I have learned so much about climate change in the last 4 years. I work with a team of people who run a project called Albert, which is a sustainability project for the television industry. And so I've been very, very fortunate to be exposed to a huge amount of science and scientific experts and yeah, people who know about sustainability and environmental systems. And this little paragraph here is absolutely accurate in terms of what happens. So let's move on to the next slide. 1.5 degrees centigrade. You probably have heard this term, the talk of the 1.5 degrees centigrade, and you know it's quite important. Well, I'm going to have to put down the chat because it's really distracting me. I love the comments though, so keep them coming. I can't wait to read them afterwards. 3 things I want you to take away. Number 1, this is the level of warming the world can tolerate. Any higher than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and it is absolutely catastrophic for society. Number 2, the UN talk about this, and what they say, and you can look this up on their website, is keeping to the target of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels will mean rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. That includes your business. That includes the activities and the choices we're going to need to make as leaders. The third thing I want you to take away from this slide is, and to understand, is that we already have reached 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial level. We are cutting it really fine. 0.4 of a degree of warming that we can tolerate before the consequences are really dire. 3.5 degrees, another number. Despite the fact that we all know that we need to keep at 1.5, and you'll remember the Paris Agreement from 2016, when every nation for the first time came together to agree, based on science, that 1.5 was the right number, was the right level of warming. Today, if you add up all of the policies, all governmental positions on this, every projection that can be gathered, and there's an amazing institution within the London School of Economics called the Grantham Institute that does this job, and you take everyone's activities and actions into account, we are currently on course to hit 3.5 degrees. So we know we need to be at 1.5, and yet everything we do, and I use we in the broadest sense because it's not all us, and I said at the beginning, this is a collaborative effort that we need to pull together on. Everything we're doing as a society, as systemically, is leading us towards 3.5. And just to really give you the horror of this, and I'm really sorry I don't have time to go into more of the evidence and the science behind this right now. I'm just going to show you what that world looks like, what 3.5 to 4 degree world would look like if we allow that to happen. The yellow areas are uninhabitable because they are desert. The brown areas are uninhabitable because they are suffering from such extreme weather events. It's impossible and incompatible with human life. The red areas are underwater now. This is about a 2-meter rise in ocean levels that takes those land masses out. So what is interesting is that where some of us are right now, but I don't think everybody, I know we've got people joining from all over the world, the places that are going to be suitable for populations to survive will be in that northern hemisphere area, and some tiny pockets in the bottom there as well in the south. I'm sorry I haven't got time to go into more detail on this, but this is what the scientific community is telling us and projecting the world will look like if we continue on the path that we're on. So, a scientific problem with so much evidence and yet has such an emotional response. You've seen me feel really emotional and passionate about this, and I know I'm not the only one out there. We see people barricading themselves and sticking themselves to buildings. We've seen Greta Thunberg striking from school, an intelligent girl, she feels so strongly about it. Likewise, we've seen all the children in our own communities take to the streets on strikes for Fridays for Future, etc. There are a number of ways in which you can respond to this crisis. The science is there. It's as close to fact as a scientist will ever be, because you know a scientist always likes to leave a degree of doubt. And I talked about the Kubler-Ross change curve yesterday, and I just thought I would pull it up there again and ask you to consider where you might be. When I first learned about all the things that I didn't know about climate change, I went through something like, you know, denial and shock and anger. And then I start bargaining, or well, if I don't go on that flight, maybe I could justify buying that piece of clothing, you know, I then sort of went through a little bit of, oh, you know, this just is too impossible, there's nothing I can do. And then I came out the other side and thought, no, actually there are some things I can do. I can use my voice as I'm doing today, and I can make some positive action. And I don't have to feel responsible for everybody else's action, nor indeed the fact that there is a systemic reason for all of this. All I can do is my bit, and I should be proud of doing my bit and do it, you know, without feeling judged or worrying about the fact that I'm a hypocrite, because we are all going to be hypocritical in this issue. So I would encourage you to feel confident about own your hypocrites. Better to do one small thing than do nothing at all. And it doesn't matter that you're still adding to emissions. We all are, and we are not in control of that because of the economic systems that underlie our society. Let me just tell you what we need to do. We need to halve our emissions, and when I say we, I'm talking societally now, halve our emissions by 2030, halve them again by 2040, and achieve net zero by 2050. And you know that we've got statutes in the UK. The UK was the first country, the first territory to make the net zero target a statutory requirement. And I suppose when you think about that from a business point of view, you've got a choice, haven't you? You can wait until a couple of years before 2050 and sort of, you know, get that sorted. And, you know, some of us might be not in business by then, so is it our problem? Or we can start to make steps today to change things in our business. It will make us more sustainable, I believe. It will make us more robust long term, more resilient, and probably feel a lot happier about ourselves as well. It's very motivational. I just want to mention a lady called Christiana Figueres. She was the executive secretary for the COP in 2016, and she, if you're interested, does an amazing podcast called Outrage and Optimism. And what she says, which I think is a really useful way to frame this, is you should be outraged that we have allowed ourselves to get to this point where we are facing such extraordinary consequences, dire consequences for the human race, for society, for citizens in the whole world. But you should also be optimistic about it. And there's a couple of reasons you'd be optimistic about it. One is, without optimism, we're stagnated. We can't possibly move forward. Without hope, without the belief we can do something about this, we are just hand tied, and there's nothing we can do to push forward. And also, we do have a good track record of solving things. We've done it before. We've done it with CFCs and lead in petrol, and the ozone layer has actually started to close up as a result of human action. So we've got every reason to feel confident about this. She says, we know we can do it because we've done it before. She says, we know that we've got the innovation, the ability to think, the technology, the ability to create the right things in order to make this happen. All we really need is the will, just to start doing it. So let's talk about this from a leadership perspective. It's a little bit of an abrupt junction from my impassioned kind of climate elements to talking about leaders. And I've been racking my brains about how to get into this with you all, so that it's meaningful, so that you can take something tangible away. And I just thought that maybe a way we could do that is to talk about risk. And I didn't want to kind of rewrite my slides after yesterday, but when I listened to Margaret in the morning talking about uncertainty related to risk, I think that it's worth holding that as a theme in your minds, because it is impossible to know what the specific implication of the climate crisis is going to be on your business. But what I do know is that we have spent historically, because of the advice of economists, probably over all of our lifetimes, making our decisions based on retrospective data. We look at our trends saying, well, you know, sales fell off last year, so we assume that they're going to carry on as they were this year. Audiences dropped, as in my industry that I specialize in, the television industry, so it's reasonable to assume that they'll continue to drop. Other things took off, and so it's reasonable to think that they will continue to take off. Well, this future has no precedent. It's completely brand new. We honestly don't know. So continuing to use retrospective data based on the systems that have been created as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution doesn't feel like a very smart thing to do, in my view. So let's talk about risk. Risk is a way that we all weigh up decisions. I mean, all that risk does is help us, guide us for decisions. They help us guide our decisions in our personal life and in our business life. That is what they're for. Should I make toast out of bread that's got some mold on it? What are the consequences of a global pandemic? If I have that extra beer, will I have a hangover? What are the consequences of climate change in terms of whether or not there's going to be a catastrophic forest fire? Should I step out into the road without looking and potentially risk getting run over by a car? So, very boring slide. I do apologise. Oh my God, this is awful, isn't it? But let's talk about how this might apply in terms of the risk factor. So there's a decision to be made, and the decision is made by weighing up the possible consequences of making that choice. So eating the bread that's got the mold on it, it is pretty unlikely that I'm going to get sick. The risk is that I'm going to get sick, I'm going to get ill. It's pretty unlikely that I'm going to get ill. I've done it before and got away with it. If I got ill, yes, okay, that would be pretty difficult to handle, but I'm probably going to recover quite quickly. I'm relatively healthy, so I'm going to say that's an acceptable risk. After all, don't have any other bread in the house right now. Crossing the road, yes, do you know what? If I got hit by a car crossing the road, it's going to be pretty significant in terms of impact. Very, very serious risk. But this chap here has got a pedestrian crossing, and we know statistically it's really unlikely that that's going to happen. So even though the impact of that is very significant, I think I'm quite happy to cross the road. I think that that's a risk I can live with. Likewise, my beer here, that extra glass of beer at the end of the evening, I'm pretty sure it's going to give me a hangover, but I want it anyway. And actually, the impact of that hangover is pretty low. So yes, it's very likely that I'm going to get a hangover, but I'm willing to live with that. I don't have a problem with that whatsoever. Now let's talk about this pandemic. So the World Health Organization has been telling governments and anyone who would listen for about 10 years that the chances of a global pandemic of the size and scale that we've just experienced, or we're experiencing now, was likely or highly likely, and yet we've ignored it. Not only is it likely or highly likely, but the impact of it is extremely high. And so we've allowed ourselves to just tolerate and make our decisions kind of ignoring this unacceptable risk, which now we can look at and see, well, yeah, it was unacceptable, and we just went blindly into it without any consequences. Now, the organizations who, not wittingly potentially because they're thinking about a pandemic, but as Margaret was saying yesterday, had bandwidth, weren't trimmed down to the absolute ends of efficiency, had 3 months worth of cash flow in the bank, didn't push themselves to the very, very end of what they could tolerate, have been able to deal with it more easily than those who are struggling to make the wage bill every month, or, you know, are very, very hand to mouth. It's more difficult for them to deal with. And so I obviously would say this, wouldn't I? But the impacts of climate change on your business, they will vary. I mean, they will vary. I can't tell you for sure what the impact of any of the climate changes will be on your business, because it will be individual to whatever you do. But if you are importing, if you have a supply chain, if you require consumers to believe in your brand, then there is very, very likely that it is going to have an impact. And the seriousness of that impact is going to range probably from moderate to high, I would estimate. You would obviously need to determine that for yourselves based on your specific circumstances. But really what we're talking about is how do we use that risk analysis to drive our decisions? There is some help out there. There is a fantastic organisation called the TCFD. They are called the Task Force for Climate Related Fiscal Disclosure, and it's headed up by Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg, but it's a voluntary organisation. It's got legs of its own now. It's quite a big thing. It's based in the States, but it is an international body, and they have created some guidance, and they do a lot of reporting, and it's industry agnostic. It's for absolutely any industry, any sector. They also ask for disclosures from large organisations as well. Some do, some don't. I'm not here to tell any business to disclose or not disclose. It really, I don't think, matters that much, actually, although obviously the data is interesting for them to see trends. But what I do think is important is that you start to think about how your governance is going to be impacted by this risk. And what the specific risk would be for you. What does that mean in terms of your strategy? What does that mean in terms of how you manage your risk? And what do you need to start measuring? And I would really just like to draw your attention to this particular recommendation here. There are 11 things that it suggests to do. Describe the resilience of the organisation's strategy, taking into consideration climate-related scenarios, including 2-degree or lower scenario. If you spend time when you're doing your management meetings or your management accounts, or you're going to your board, or you're talking to your trustees, depending on whatever kind of business you've got, thinking about whether or not you need to test the fire alarms, thinking about what your financial risk is going to be, what your consumer numbers are doing, tracking all of that kind of thing, then at least I would say once every couple of months, the climate risk should be on the agenda, and you should be talking about what, if anything, you should be doing about it. So, a resilient business. I mentioned that we've got to halve our emissions by 2030. And I also mentioned that it's not your responsibility as an individual or as a business leader to hold this on your own. But I do believe that we need to do it together. And there's a couple of things that you need to consider, probably. Number one is your carbon budget, if you like. So I'm working with an organisation at the moment, and they are exploring the idea of how they can measure their entire carbon budget and then reduce it 5% year on year, so that they hit that 5%, that 50% target of 2030, which is really bold and really exciting. Now, they will have a few little helping hands, because as you know, you've probably seen in the press, we've stopped burning coal in the UK, and therefore our carbon factors for the UK have come down, which means if you're running a business, and even if you weren't in a pandemic with you know, people being at home instead of in the office, even if everything was equal, you would see your emissions drop in terms of the amount of electricity you use, because the carbon factors are dropping. So you just kind of get some helping hands from the government as well. But if you're not measuring that, if you're not understanding exactly where those touch points are, then you can't possibly know, and you can't make action over and above that potentially to change it. So I strongly suggest that you measure your carbon footprint. Then then take steps to reduce. 9 times out of 10, reducing your carbon footprint usually will give you some sort of financial benefit. What we've seen in the television industry, and we have a lot of data about production processes, is that generally speaking, not in every case, but generally speaking, especially now, you start to see, because the choices you make are driven from a different criteria, actually it drops out cash too. So, for example, taking the train to Manchester instead of a flight. Doing 2 meetings instead of going twice to a location, that type of thing. It kind of makes sense. And then explore and consider offsetting the rest. I will talk a little bit more about offsetting in a sec. Think about adaptation. So scenario planning is really, really important, because if you have a location that in the map I showed you might be underwater in those scenarios, then what do you need to start doing in order to be ready for that? Now, obviously, we hope that doesn't happen. That's what we're actively trying to avoid. But I do think that if you're getting, leather is imported from a country that's going to be impacted significantly by climate change. If you're a belt maker, if you import a food from another country that is going to be impacted by climate change, if you are dependent on materials, or in the fashion industry, there's a huge amount of implications around water and irrigation. There's so many touch points for this. They'll be specific to your industry. But if you can scenario plan, then you can start to see where the points of adaptation might need to be. You can embrace that into your strategy, and then you can make plans to change. And if you can do all of that, then your business is going to be stable for a lot longer, and you won't be in a situation where either you're reacting to legislation, because legislation is definitely going to come, and we've seen it in the car industry. We've seen policies overturned in terms of Heathrow. We've seen all sorts of very, very large public industry changes. That's going to continue. The spotlight will reach us all eventually, is my thought on that. So very, very quickly, let's just talk about why this is an opportunity. I really do believe it is an opportunity. I spoke to a stakeholder about let's see, when was it? About 4 or 5 months ago, who runs a very, very large creative organisation. And I was talking to him about the long tail of television and what it might mean in terms of what we see on TV, see on screen. And he said, oh my gosh, I've just had a complete brain moment. This is amazing. There's nothing like a big challenge like this that makes creative people innovate. And he started rubbing his hands together. He was sort of gleeful about it. Now, the pandemic has offered us another angle on that opportunity. This idea of building back better. Quite a lot of organisations and people working in this space are starting to use this language. You wouldn't rebuild your house if it fell down with the wonky stairs and the hole in the roof, or in the case of this house, on a slant with no windows. So there may well be opportunities, if you can take that moment, just have a pause, do your scenario planning to see what you could do that would enable you to build your business back in a new way that has a longer term impact for you, makes you more resilient. I will just talk to you briefly about Gucci. Gucci have said farewell to fashion weeks, and they've gone seasonless. That's what they've actually done. They used to run something like 7 different fashion weeks per year all over the globe, and they've got rid of them. Now, for me, that shows great innovation. It's very motivational. They're positioning themselves at the head of the game, the first big brand of this nature to do that. They're creating a legacy, and they're stabilizing their business. Now, I know it is extraordinarily difficult, because this is going to have an impact on people's jobs, but I showed you what the alternative is. This is going to have an impact on every human being, and we need to be responsible for that in a much more holistic way. And it's very, very difficult to make those decisions that impacts people's jobs in a local way, but you really are trading the entire future of humanity, if you like. I was going to just briefly read, what time is it? 1 minute, read you what Alessandro Michel said. Now, he's very flowery and impassioned, and then I've just got one more slide and we'll do some Q&A. He says, above all, we understand we went too far. Our reckless actions have burned the house we live in. We conceive of ourselves as separate from nature. We felt cunning and almighty. We usurped nature, we dominated it, and we wounded it. We incited Prometheus and buried Pan. Whoa! So much haughtiness made us lose our sisterhood with the butterflies, the flowers, the trees and the roots. So much outrageous greed made us lose the harmony, the care and the connection and the belonging. Oh my God, it's so emotional. Now, that is not suitable for most of us to use as language, but the very fact that he is willing to go on record with such extraordinary language, and yes, I know it's all about positioning and marketing and being, you know, front of everyone's front of mind on this, but still, you know, that's pretty bold. And I think, you know, despite all of the issues and the underlying problems with it, should be applauded. So here's your to-do list if you're willing. Number one, put the planet on the agenda. Just talk about it, have a conversation about it, write a green memo, have a policy, put someone in charge in your team that's a bit hippie. Measure your impacts. It's a really, really, really good idea to start with your personal impacts. On the WWF website, there is a place you can do the WWF, I think it's /footprint. You type in how often you commute, whether you eat meat or not, all of those kinds of things, and it spits out your carbon footprint. What you will find is it will surprise you if you haven't done it before, then you're not informed on this issue, I believe. Because what it will show you is the things that we're obsessed with in the media, like our obsession with plastic bottles, is probably going to be couple of % of your footprint, whereas things like how you heat your home, how you travel are going to be much more significant, and your food intake will be much more significant. So I really recommend you do that. Then please make one small change, and do not feel guilty about the fact that you still do things that emit. We all do. I do. Everybody does. There is so much you can't change, but there is one thing you can. And I just set myself a target to change one small thing kind of every few months, one more small thing. And I managed to get 5 tons out of my carbon footprint as a result of doing that. And I'm happier and healthier as a result. The co-benefits of the changes you make are usually very, very positive for you as an individual and as a business leader. Explore offsetting schemes. It will not be as expensive as you think. It costs me, for my business, Lily Gray, less than £100 to offset my entire carbon footprint for a year. So I pre-bought £350 for 3 years, and I overpaid a little bit just in one hit about a year or so ago, so I didn't have to think about it. If you're a larger business, it's going to be different, obviously, but a European flight would be about £3.50 to offset. Scenario plan for the future of your business. Take the time to do that. If you scenario plan about what you would do if the Thames barrier broke and that your building could be underwater, then you should be planning for this scenario as well. Adjust your strategy based on your own specific risks, so they will be individual to you, and make a plan for change. And I am Tricia Duffy, and I run Lily Gray, and I am here to help people deal with very, very complex problems. And that, you'll be pleased to know, is all from me. So let me come out of that. Stop share.
Well done. Awesome.
Thank you. That was a bit quick, wasn't it? Sorry about the speedy talking, everybody.
Well, there's a lot there, a lot to unpack, and you're kind of just really touching the surface, aren't you, with you know, what we're all facing. And I think the kind of pandemic, you know, we have this shared sense that we're all in this together, and the climate crisis is exactly the same. So lots of action in chat, and we've got a few questions as well to get through. I think the hypocrisy comments kind of resonated with me and resonated with everybody else. And, you know, we all have to, you know, I think the one thing which I said yesterday, we have to kind of participate in these systems, don't we? And these systems are actually kind of killing us and the planet. Yeah. And it's kind of accepting, understanding that and not judging other people, I think, which is important. But
100%.
And kind of John made a couple of comments earlier on. I think one which is quite interesting is, you know, how do we get leaders bought into, or how do we tell the story really through data, but actually also allowing people to kind of feel their hearts? Because this is not just a pure data rational problem, is it? This is something which is, you know, needs to be emotionally connected. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about actually how we communicate this message better.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's everyone's responsibility to communicate the message, is it? I mean, I'm here trying to kind of tell a story around business leadership. We don't all have to take that role of telling the story. Um, but I mean, what we find in the broadcasting industry is that stories do count and they do matter, and we use narrative a lot in order to be able to unpick this. So it really does depend on your audiences. I mean, who was it yesterday who said, you know, if the facts and the figures are not working, you need to try another approach? And we talk a lot in the project that I run about the different audience groups we are and how do we get them to participate. So we talk about those people that are able to hold the idea of climate change as a big holistic issue in their heads, and they want to come at it from quite a kind of I say sort of socialist almost sociology type framing, if you like, to think about it as a global issue. So, you know, somebody who probably works for Greenpeace might think in that way. And you've got other people who genuinely like to be involved in the thing they think is the right on thing. And so actually, if that's the way they come at it, why don't we give them the tools that they need to make it trendy, make it cool, make it fun? You know, an electric car is so much more fun to drive than a petrol one. I can tell you that for sure. So let's give those people who are the sort of gold prospectors. There's a really fantastic organisation called Futura, who are a communications company who specialise in sustainability, and they talk about gold prospectors. They want to have their latest trainers, and if you make it trendy, they'll get on board. And that, I think, is very important for business leaders if you're in a consumer world, because you are going to be, if you're looking for young people to start buying and investing in your products, they are well informed, they're better informed than most. And so actually to be able to engage with them on that level and show them that you have a purpose that cares about this is going to serve you in good stead. And then the other group of people that you've got to think about are those that are very community minded, and they just cannot get their heads around a breadth of an issue as you can, Ben, because you talk about kind of all this left brain and, you know, social injustice and all of that. They can only think about the fact that their neighbour doesn't have enough food. But actually, truly, the benefits of climate change, that will come out through sort of a more climate sensitive future, are almost certainly going to benefit those communities as well, because we're talking about sharing stuff, having more money in our pockets when we need to make less, when we're less driven by consumerism. So there are benefits for everybody, no matter how you're coming at it, whether you want to be on the latest thing, whether you want to think about it from a bold issue, or whether you want to just do something for your neighbour. There are benefits at every level, I believe.
Cool. And so you touched on consumption there, and John made a comment that we all need to do our bit, and millions of us need to consume less. And so when we talk about sustainability, the kind of word's really about sustaining something. So what is it that we're actually sustaining? Are we okay if we're all driving around in electric cars, we're all flying the same number of journeys and holidays, but on cleaner transport, we're all consuming the same food, but it's just slightly better produced? So what I'm trying to understand is are we sustaining the economic model of consumption? And
Yeah.
actually, if we meet the carbon targets, that consuming the same amount which we do today is okay, or is that kind of bundled up with the same problem with climate change, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, so there's lots of people that have talked about the fact that, you know, so much of this is out of our control because the economic model is designed and held up by consumerism and capitalism and abundance and dependence on fossil fuels. And you can't break that as an individual. It's impossible. So you shouldn't expect that you can break that as an individual. Why on earth would we try and make one person feel responsible for that? You just can't do it. It's really unfair, and it stops you from making progress. But so it's really difficult. I'm not, you know, I don't have the brain big enough to be able to answer the question about how we unfold our economic model. What I can tell you is, though, that we will need to consume less. And when you consume less, you probably do actually feel happier. You have a lot of co-benefits. You have more money in your pocket. Maybe that means you need to work less. I don't know. There's loads of ways in which you could extrapolate that for yourself as an individual. Mm. I'm looking at the chat and it's really distracting me. I must switch it off. Hang on a minute. Let me just do that because it's stopping me from having my flow. I was going to make another point there, but I've completely forgotten it. So ask me another question and maybe it'll come back to me.
We've got a couple of questions coming from Andrew, actually. So his first one is, we sure we haven't already passed the point to stop the 1.5 degrees being reached without drastic action?
Yeah, so the scientists tell us we haven't, is what I can tell you. But there is a time lag. So that is a really interesting point, actually. So the implications of climate change that we are seeing today, the incredible forest fires in Australia, the hurricanes that we see much more regularly now, are the consequence of the emissions and the carbon dioxide that was put into the atmosphere about 30 years ago, approximately. So we will see more extreme weather events of that type continue over the next 30 years. So the implications for this in terms of society are already foretold in such a way, and it will become more tangible because we'll see, you know, we've had flooding in the UK, we've seen the forest fires. I mean, you don't have to I don't need to tell you the extraordinary consequences of the impact on the weather systems as a result of climate change. So we're going to see that. That's already built in. So what we can't do is switch it off today. If we went to zero today, you're still going to see a 30-year lag in terms of the impacts of that, and it will be a long time before you start to see them reduce. It's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to deal with this issue, isn't it? It's because you're in a circumstance where economies and political systems are built on such a short-term basis. If someone's only in power for 4 years or 8 years or whatever, they don't have the responsibility for what the world's going to be like in 30 years. It's one of the fundamental issues. So really, this does need to be more altruistic. And I think that, you know, if possible, to find your way to come at it, whether that be about your business, whether that be about your neighbour, whether that be about, you know, I want to hold the whole issue, which is kind of more my style. You know, find your way to come into it and do one small thing so that we can all contribute and start to put it on the agenda and ask our leaders, I suppose, to think about the longer term consequences for our planet and for our society.
Yeah, I really like that, because we don't have to be passengers in our system. You know, we you know, if the system isn't working for us and we can actually understand that, then we can make active choices. It's more difficult going against the system because the system just everything, doesn't it? But I think increasingly more and more people are actually pushing back. So I like that. And Andrew asked the question about COVID-19. Now, obviously, we're spending less time on the roads. We're traveling less. How does that not only it makes a point that actually it opens people's eyes to what's going on in the world in terms of emissions, but how are we doing now versus our targets? Does this mean that we're now ahead of our targets because of
Oh, do you know what? I honestly can't answer that question without any scientific surety. But what I do know is that we really need to make sure that when things are relaxed and we're able to go back, is that we don't just go straight back to whatever normal was before we were this new normal. The thing I was going to say to you earlier, actually, which is relevant to this, is that 50% of the world's emissions are created by 10% of the population. So when you think about your responsibility, if you're a leader of a successful business, you might be in the category of slightly more affluent, and therefore it's likely that your emissions and your contributions to the issue are more significant. So, you know, the change really does need to come at the more privileged end of society, and really you're talking about those people, you know, lucky or unlucky enough to have a private jet and a yacht. And so the systemic change needs to make something else. And this comes back to this kind of idea of people who kind of want to latch onto the cool thing. Let's make something else cool. Let's make something else desirable, aspirational, incredible. Because a walk in the countryside, sitting outside, you know, and not having planes fly overhead as I usually do here in West London is a joy. It's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this, mentioning the top 10%, so this is why climate change and social justice are all kind of wrapped up all together.
100%, yeah.
You can't actually separate, can you?
The people who will be most impacted by this crisis are the most vulnerable parts of society. And that is the thing that's one of my core reasons I tried to articulate at the beginning as to why I'm so passionate about this issue, is, you know, the the social justice angle of it is it consumes me. It's the thing that keeps me awake at night.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, we're almost up for time, but just a question on role models. So obviously, on the one hand, we've got people like Greta, who are kind of brilliant communicators about the scale of the problems and facing up to world leaders. On the other hand, you've got people like Trump, who won't acknowledge and engage, and he's just a product of the system which we're talking about. So yeah, I guess this is probably just a kind of word really for leaders and role models. What do we do? How do we think about people like Trump? And
well, I know what I think. But I would not like to put any words in anyone's mouth. I mean, have your own view about this and decide your own way. If you think whatever suits you as an individual. I mean, for me, working with this project that I work with, Albert, changed my life. It absolutely changed my life, and it changed my life for the better. And I don't have a huge reach. I'm not the biggest role model out there, but I do try, when I have a voice and I have a platform, to do my small part in order to try and help give people confidence about embracing the issue and making the change and being okay with the fact that they can't get it all right. There's no judgment here. It's just, let's do the thing that we can do. So I think be your own role model. Think about what it is that you want to, if you have children, think about what you want them to look at back and see that you did during this time when we are given this information and we're potentially choosing to ignore it. I mean, think about there's a theory I'm not very familiar with, actually. It's on my reading list. It's around seventh generation planning. I don't know if you ever heard about it. It's really amazing kind of theory that some communities, particularly indigenous communities, have as a way to make their plans. Seventh generation planning doesn't make decisions or plans based on what's happening to the current generations. It looks 7 generations ahead to see whether their decisions and their impacts are going to benefit or disbenefit those generations, which as a kind of an ideal, I think is nominally exciting. And so maybe even if it wasn't 7th generation, maybe if it's only 2nd or 3rd, that might help us to just make different kinds of decisions and feel more confident and proud to act differently on this issue.